Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Halifax International Security Forum in Nova Scotia, Canada, one of the world's leading gatherings of defense, economic, political, civil society leaders and thinkers from around the world. And we're joined by Robin Shepherd, who is one of the hosts here, one of the moderators and also the security advisor to the forum, one-time journalist who spent too many years in Moscow ultimately, and then went into the think tank world at Chatham House, where you directed the European program. So I can't imagine having anybody better to have this conversation with you than you. So last year at the forum, everybody was in a state of shock, I think is fair to say, that Donald Trump had been elected president of the United States, and especially concerned about some of the skepticism that he had been expressing about the NATO, about the Atlantic Alliance. It's been a year. You've watched very, very closely some of the things that him and his team have said. On the one hand, there's the rhetoric. On the other hand, is the reality with more troops. Talk to us about how perceptions of Trump, where he's sort of defied expectations and where he's sort of lived up to expectations from a European perspective.
I think that in Europe there's been a certain amount of surprise, because if you follow Donald Trump's Twitter account, then you're going to get one view of the president's view of the world. If you looked at the campaign rhetoric in 2016, you get another view. But actually, if you look at what's going on the ground, the United States remains fully and fundamentally engaged in the Western security architecture. It's actually putting more troops in Europe. It's moving further into Afghanistan. It is not backing off when it's come to North Korea. It hasn't been the United States saying that's somebody else's problem. The United States has been fully engaged. So I think that we are now a year after the election and 10 months into the actual presidency. And I think that while it would be wrong to say that concerns have been fully allayed about President Trump, I think that a lot of people have kind of sobered up. They've seen that the United States remains the leading power in the Western world, that it is not disengaged, it hasn't retreated inside its own borders. And while I think that people still want more reassurance, I think that there is a lot more in terms of continuity than people expected.
And where do you see one of the things that the president came in May to Europe to put pressure on governments to spend more money? A German friend of mine told me, look, I mean, we've all been spending more money anyway. We agreed in 2014 to spend more money. Don't be rough coming to our house and beating us over the head. Do you think that there's any negative repercussion to that? On the one hand, governments are spending more money for a variety of reasons, in part because of a changed threat perception. But is there a potential backlash, given that he has something like a 9% popularity rating in Europe ultimately? Talk to us about whether or not you think that the rhetoric is actually what's driven any of the change. And then the flip side, does the rhetoric push European countries to be significantly more independent from the United States, which may be good in one sense, but actually not good in another sense?
Well, President Trump is not extremely popular in Europe. I mean, let's face it, the opinion polls all show that. Nonetheless, the United States remains by far and away the most powerful country in the world, and by far and away the most powerful country in the Western world. When it comes to the way Europeans especially have failed to live up to their obligation, or at least their moral obligation, to be spending 2% of GDP on defense, it isn't just Donald Trump who was giving the Europeans a kicking about that. Barack Obama was just the same. George W. Bush was just the same. This has been going on for a long time. The Europeans have pledged to spend more on defense. It's still a long way, in most cases, from 2% of GDP, which is that benchmark. And it's going to take a long time for them to get there. I think that because of the rhetoric from the United States, the Europeans, and Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, has pretty much said as much, it is the case that Europe is going to have to look after itself. And if you're going to look after yourself, you're going to have to start ponying up some more money. And one of the kind of paradoxes is that although that American presidents have been saying you've got to spend more money for a long time, my perception is that with Donald Trump, the Europeans are actually starting to believe it. And so, people like the Secretary General of NATO, who would be far too diplomatic to say it, of course, might be secretly quite pleased that the Americans have become quite vocal under Donald Trump about this, because the Europeans are actually trying to do things. And they just this week, they set up this very awkwardly named initiative called PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation Initiative, which is billed by some as the creation of a European army. Okay, fine, a European army, it's got to be paid for. And I think that most people, the Secretary General of NATO said just now at the Halifax Forum, we've been complaining about Europeans not spending enough on defence. Well, if they go ahead and do that, that's all to the good.
Well, that's right. I mean, it was Bob Gates when he came to Europe and delivered what was at the time seen as sort of a stunning message of the conditionality of U.S. support, which I think people have a tendency of forgetting. Although it didn't have some of the rougher edges to it, I think that's at least presentationally that President Trump had. Let's talk about European right-wing movements and how they could actually metastasize into a bigger problem for the continent. We saw in the UK where that manifested itself in terms of the Brexit vote. I mean, UKIP ran for decades on getting independence and then getting out of Brexit, and then once it got it, it tended to dissolve relatively rapidly. But we've seen Geert Wilders in Netherlands. We've seen Le Pen, gave a fairly strong run there against Macron as sort of one of the leading candidates ultimately in a runoff. And we've seen a rise also in Germany now, which has a lot of people worried. Germany, which is also has pledged by 2024 to be spending 2%, which will be an awful lot of money ultimately. What are some of the challenges that's going to present, and how could it hamstring actually European decision making, whether it's on security or on military matters?
Well, obviously, if European democracy falls apart, we've got a problem. And Europe has a very checkered history when it comes to nationalism. It isn't obviously just Germany. There are lots of countries that have had a terrible problem with aggressive nationalism. And in the last few years, in the last 5 to 10 years, we've certainly seen the rise of far-right populist movements. And they're a problem. And they're a problem in their own right. They're a problem because, people in the mainstream have to respond. I mean, if you're a populist party and you're getting 15 or 20% of the vote, then maybe the centre-right parties feel a bit of a temptation to try and steal some of their ground. How do they do that? Well, they start toying with, adopting parts of some of their policies, and this is an enormous issue. The one thing I always say to Americans, to Canadians, to people outside the United Kingdom is don't see Brexit in the same vein as Marine Le Pen in France or Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. Brexit was partially driven by a populist movement called UKIP. Interestingly, it was mainly driven by the British Conservative Party. Inside the British Conservative Party was one of the most established parties in international politics, not just European politics. And I actually think that a couple of years down the road, when Britain is out of the European Union, you won't see an awful lot of difference. Britain is very committed to NATO. It spends 2%. It's one of the very few countries that spends 2% of GDP on defence expenditure. It also spends 0.7% of GDP on international aid and development. So it is one of the most internationally engaged countries in the world, and it is going to remain so.
Robin, thanks very much. We really appreciate it.